Thank you.
Next, we have Mark Meckler with the Convention of States as proponent testimony. Thanks.
Good afternoon, or good morning, Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee. Thank you for having us today. We appreciate you hearing the citizens speak to this issue. Again, my name is Mark Meckler. I'm the president of Citizens for Self-Governance and the Convention of States Project, and we are the organization moving this forward nationally. One correction to Senator Rulli's testimony. Things are moving so fast. He said 15 states have passed the resolution. Just in the last 90 days, 4 more states have passed the resolution, so we're now at 19 states. So our hope and the hopes of over 100,000 people who've signed the petition here in Ohio is that Ohio will become magic number 20. So it'd be a good threshold to cross. I want to step back and do a little bit of history, if I might, and that history starts in 1787 when this clause gets entered into the Constitution. It's 2 days before the end of convention, September 15, 1787. It's that hot summer in Philadelphia we all know about. The Constitution is completely drafted. The final draft is prepared for signature, and Colonel George Mason from Virginia stands to address the Assembly. And I paraphrase, but he says basically we have a terrible problem with the document we've drafted. We've given the power to Congress to propose amendments, but we've not given the same power to the people acting through the states. And then he asks the question, are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will ever propose the proper kinds of amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Now, I've said that line in hundreds of events around the country. Senator, I see a smile at that. People smile, people laugh, because no tyrant in human history has ever restrained himself or herself. No tyrannical government has ever decided, well, we have too much power, we're going to give it back to the people. So the founders, the framers, understood human nature. They stands at the appropriate moment and point a flaw in the document. And interestingly, Madison's notes reflect this. In 2 very small abbreviated Latin words, he says nin com, which means no comment. There's no debate about this. In other words, the men assembled there decided that this was so self-evident that they unanimously voted to put this clause in the Constitution. It's a clause which gives you, as state legislators, extraordinary power. In fact, you're the most powerful people in the federal government. And when you come here and when you take your oath and you're sworn in and you're given your orientation and they show you where the restrooms are in the committee hearings and your new office, they probably don't tell you you're the most powerful people in the federal government, because only legislatures have the power to call a convention, to propose amendments at that convention, and then to ratify those amendments, thereby changing the very structure of our system of government. The president doesn't have that power. Congress was not given that power. I would argue sometimes the courts take that power. They were not given that power, but you were given that power. And I think it's important to understand why you were given that power. The founders never said, the framers never said, well, you know, state governments, they'll be filled with angels. Those will be the perfect people, and those in the federal government will be bad people. What they said was, we believe in government close to the people. We believe in the elected officials who have to go live among their constituents, and frankly, all of them were you. They sat on state governments, in colonial governments, on town councils. They knew what it was like to live among their constituents, and so they had faith in people who were engaged in that process. That's why they gave you that power. Some of this has been discussed today, but you'll hear arguments. The only argument ever given against the idea of a convention of states is that the convention will run away. Now, you heard some discussion about that today. And they'll propose amendments they're not authorized to propose, and in doing so, we'll lose our beloved Constitution. I think this is really important. Excuse me, stepping forward here for a moment. The question that must be asked when we say we'll lose our beloved Constitution is, what Constitution are you referring to? Many people in this room are probably carrying a pocket Constitution, 25 or 30 pages. You can carry it around with you in your breast pocket. But if you order the Constitution from the United States Government Publishing Office, the GPO, that's what you'll get. This was published in 2012. If they do it every 10 years, they haven't published 2022 yet because they say they don't have enough money to do that, which I find ironic. This is with supplements over 3,000 pages. It weighs over 10 pounds, and it contains every single case ever issued by the United States Supreme Court, telling us what that beautiful, small, concise, well-written document, the United States Constitution, means. Over 3,000 pages. So when people say we need to protect our beloved Constitution, the question is, what is it that we're trying to protect? There are important, I would argue, seminal cases in here protecting the rights of United States citizens, and I think these are critical. But there are also decisions in here that have grossly expanded the power of the federal government in a way that the founders and the framers never imagined. The government itself has grown beyond our wildest imagination of our framers and founders. In fact, we talk often about the debate between large and small government had between Jefferson and Hamilton. The Hamiltonian style of big central government, the Jeffersonian of agrarian society of a limited government. Hamilton and Jefferson agreed on this critical idea. They said that government has exclusive spheres of influence. And what they meant by that is a state, if a state is authorized to do something, then the federal government is not, and vice versa. They would be stunned to see the overlap. I've been in 48 states in this great country in the last few years. I've been in the legislatures in most of them. The most common complaint I hear from Democrats and Republicans alike is, if only the federal government would get out of our business and let us do what we know how to do. 60 to 65% of every state budget today is controlled in some way or another by the federal government. It's an outrage. Runaway convention, coming back to this Constitution. First of all, it takes 34 states to call a convention, and those states must call a convention according to the same outline. That's why we have our outline: fiscal restraints on the federal government, term limits for federal officials, not just Congress, but potentially deep state bureaucrats. Fauci shouldn't be in the federal government for 50 years, for one. And then finally, limits on the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. It takes 34. How do we know for sure 34? How do we know that's for sure a limitation? There have been over 400 applications to Congress for a convention of states. We've just never reached the 2/3 threshold. So that is de facto evidence that it takes the same limitation by every state. That's how we know there's a limitation in place. There's a lot of law around this. I hear a lot of confusion. People say, we have no idea what would happen at a convention of states. There's an entire legal treatise written on this called the Law of Article 5. If you're genuinely interested, and also if you're having trouble sleeping at night, it's a treatise you might want to read, but it'll fill you in on all the legal background, all the case law on this, all the precedent, all the history around this. There cannot be a runaway convention. This is something that was invented by people that don't like the idea of the American people rising up and doing what the founders intended for us to do. Specifically going to gun rights, sitting on our legal board of references, Charles Cooper, he's written an open letter in this regard. He is the number one Second Amendment litigator in the United States of America, litigated in protection of the Second on behalf of the NRA for over 30 years. He says the idea of a runaway convention affecting gun rights is outrageous. I'll close with this, and then I'm happy to take questions. It's not a question of whether this is in the United States Constitution. It's there. You can look it up. It's not a question of whether the founders intended for us to use it, because we have the record of the founders' proceedings there in 1787 on September 15th telling us exactly what they meant. We have the Federalist Papers telling us that the founders intended for us to use this if we came to a point where we felt like the federal government had gotten out of control. We have numerous people throughout American history, Eisenhower, Reagan, on forward into the modern era, Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Ben Shapiro, Steve Dace, and on, legal scholars all across the country saying this is limited, safe, and now is the time to use it. And I'll close with this. This is not a partisan matter. This is not a fringe far right or far left matter. This is a matter for the American people. When polled broadly all across the United States of America, over 66% of Americans, when they say they understand what this is, when they're told what it is, they are in favor. And here in your own home state of Ohio, over 100,000 people have now signed a petition asking you to support this resolution. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions for the witness? Senator Craig?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your testimony this morning, sir. How are the delegates chosen?
The delegates are chosen, Senator, in what I would describe as perfect federalism. In other words, each state legislature itself chooses how to choose their own delegates. So I've seen in the 19 states that have done this, a lot of states after they pass the resolution are passing delegate selection legislation. So it will be up to your legislature. You could choose a certain number chosen by the House, some chosen by the Senate, possibly a choice by the governor. It varies from state to state, but every state has the right to choose. Important to note, regardless of how many delegates are chosen, each state gets one vote at convention. It's a convention of states.
Thank you.
Senator Serino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Meckler. Just a couple of thoughts I want to share and maybe get your views on it. Again, I think, you know, if we want to look at the financial or the fiscal issue that is proposed as part of this, we have only to look at the level of debt that we have, as was pointed out earlier by the two senators, in the inflation that results from this. You don't have to be a master's degree or a PhD in economics to understand that the two are connected, and that we're headed down a path that is, we may never be able to come back from if we don't get our arms around this. And I recall, in terms of the Constitution itself, I remember back in 1996, I had the pleasure of introducing Senator Bob Dole at an event where I live in Lake County, and was standing in the back behind the curtain waiting to introduce him, as he was a candidate for president at that time. And he pulled out of his pocket, out of his coat pocket, a copy of the Constitution. Not that one, because his pocket was not that big, but and he gave me a 10-minute. I mean, I'm standing there with, you know, I think he was Senate Majority Leader at the time. I'm standing there with him, kept explaining to me. And he is an American hero, as we all know, certainly suffered greatly for our democracy. And he lectured me on the value of the Constitution and what a blessed document it is. And he also talked with me about the principle of subsidiarity, which prior to that encounter, I really hadn't thought much about it, quite frankly, which really begs to the local issue. Subsidiary principle means that you bring things down to the lowest possible point. And we in state government fight federal policies all the time because they're making their decisions for the people of Ohio, and we object to that, and we sue the federal government in many areas. And I think we just have to, you know, I agree with you. It's not a partisan issue here. It shouldn't be. Getting a hold of our federal government and making sure that enumerated powers don't get expanded, you know, decade after decade to a point where we are right now. That this isn't a left or right issue, I think. This is a, how do we maintain the integrity, the original integrity of the Constitution in the first place by preventing its, and going back and changing the expansionism that we have seen over the decades in the document that governs. So just any thoughts or reactions? Sorry, that wasn't a question, but.
Look, we're in 100% agreement. If you go back to the 1980s, there was actually a balanced budget amendment convention proposed for that purpose. It's hard to imagine this at this point, and what I'm about to say sounds fantastical, but at that point we had $4 trillion in debt, and we thought that was outrageous. Today we're over $30 trillion in debt. And by the way, we got within 2 states of calling a convention for a balanced budget amendment, and it was defeated by an alliance of people who were on the far left and the far right. Is pretty amazing to think. And by the way, same people who oppose this today. So I think we can look back across history and say, thanks for nothing to those folks. And today, for the people who are making the same arguments, we have to ask the question, do you even understand your history? And I would close my comments on what you said with this. George Washington, in his farewell address, which most people don't realize was never actually spoken, it was a written address, he said that if we ever found that we were in trouble constitutionally, that we should use the process found in the Constitution to make amendments, and he warned us against making amendments by what he called accretion. In other words, by not using the process, by having government just expand its own rights through legislation, which is essentially what we've done. You referred to the enumerated powers. There were originally only 17. I think they're innumerable at this point. You can't even possibly count them. What we're trying to do is not to change the Constitution. We're working to restore it to what the framers and the founders originally intended.
Thank you. Senator Johnson with a question or comment.
Thank you, Chairman.
Or both.
Maybe.
Or both, maybe.
I haven't decided yet. Thank you very much, and quite revelatory, the Constitution that you would get from the government. That's how they see it, huh?
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. It's about $130, so it's not cheap, and they're hard to get right now because they're out of print, which is ironic that they have trillions of dollars, but not enough to print the Constitution.
I talk to a lot of people, I was a state representative before I became a state senator. And there's a lot of doom and gloom out there, a lot of feeling powerless, a lot of despair, a lot of distrust for the federal government and even state government, because we seem complicit in the process that allows the federal government to run rampant. And I have often said that in the days of George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and all the amazing people that signed the Declaration of Independence, in the years that followed, the couple of decades that followed, they always assumed that the best people would represent the people closest to home. And indeed, you look at their example, they set the example. They didn't write it down. They intended the best people from a state to be right there in their communities, being city councilmen, being state legislators. A lot of those folks were participants in writing state constitutions. They wrote a very simple document that is so simple it took geniuses to write. A lot of people think that if you're going to write about something complex, the prose needs to be complex. And in fact, it's just the opposite. True genius is in simplicity. They wrote it so anyone could understand it. When we look at that gloom and despair that we have in our country, I always say there's nothing that we can't rectify if we go back to the original intent and use the document that we were gifted. And I truly believe we were gifted that document through the inspiration of God Almighty. And it's reflected in the writings and the attitudes of the people that wrote this. Can you tell me any reason why we shouldn't do this?
Senator, I cannot think of a single reason why we shouldn't do this. Some people will say the time is not ripe. Things are not bad enough. It's not dangerous enough right now. You know, I'm 60 years old. I'm probably not the oldest guy in the room, certainly not the youngest. I've lived to see a lot. 1980s, Ronald Reagan was my first vote. I could never imagine that we would be living in the times that we're living in right now. And so, if not now, as the famous phrase goes, if not now, then when? If not us, then who? And if you go all the way back to Reagan, one of the things that Reagan said that I consider most profound, he said a lot of incredible quotable things. This is not one of his most famous quotes, but I think it's important to me. He said back then, they say we live in a time when there are no heroes, they just don't know where to look. And in that speech, he goes on to describe that all around him, all around all of us, all around this room, sitting up on that dais today are American heroes. And I think this darkness and this gloom that you talk about, and I get a lot of that as a grassroots leader. I get emails every day telling me it's over, we've lost our country, we've lost our sovereignty. I know differently. And I know differently from my perspective for two reasons. Because I know you. I know legislators like McCulley and Ruley who are willing to take a stand. I travel to legislatures all over the country. Washington, D.C. makes me depressed. I go there too. But I come to state legislatures and I have hope. And I travel with the American people and I have hope. And for me, foundationally, it all rests on my faith and the Holy Father. And I will never not have hope because I've been saved by grace. And so for me and for the American people and the foundation of our country, I think that's the bedrock foundation. And if we turn back to the founding and what the founders believed, how this country was formed, I don't think there's anything we can't do.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senators. I'm here live in Philadelphia at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. When you hear the phrase lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, these are the folks we should think of, those who anonymously gave their lives. Well, today you have a chance to volunteer. You need to volunteer for conventionofstates.com, the movement that's going to save the country. These folks are willing to step up and give everything. We need you to give just a little bit. Go to conventionofstates.com and volunteer today.